Early June 1940. Ships are pulling into Dover Harbor one after another, and exhausted, wounded, devastated-looking soldiers are stepping off. Their uniforms are torn, their faces covered in soot and grime, and there's an indescribable look in their eyes. These are British soldiers who have just made it out of the hell that was Dunkirk. But right now, there's only one question running through their minds. What's waiting for us back home? And believe me, none of them could have guessed the right answer. If you want to discover one of the most dramatic and emotional moments of World War II, this video is for you. Don't forget to subscribe to my channel, hit the notification bell, and like this video, because this story will reveal one of the least known but most human sides of war history. If you're ready, let's begin. The final days of May 1940 marked a turning point for the entire world. Adolf Hitler's Wehrmacht forces had invaded France with a strategy that defied everyone's expectations. German tanks and aircraft were advancing so rapidly that Allied forces were forced to retreat before they could even catch their breath. Right in the middle of this chaos, approximately 400,000 British, French, and Belgian soldiers found themselves trapped on the beaches of Dunkirk, a small town on the northern coast of France. Behind them was the English Channel, and in front of them was the merciless German army. The situation was completely hopeless. Winston Churchill and the British War Cabinet believed that the vast majority of these soldiers would either die or be captured. Initial estimates suggested that at most 30,000 to 45,000 men could be rescued. That number didn't even account for 10% of the total force. But then, a miracle happened. Between May 26th and June 4th, 1940, the evacuation operation that would go down in history as Operation Dynamo was launched. Royal Navy destroyers, merchant ships, and most importantly, hundreds of civilian vessels, including fishing boats, yachts, river cruisers, and even small sailboats, crossed the English Channel to rescue these soldiers. For 9 days, under constant bombardment from the German Luftwaffe, this brave armada of sailors managed to transport 338,226 soldiers to England. Approximately 200,000 of them were British, and the rest were soldiers from other Allied nations, the majority of them French. Churchill described this event as a miracle of deliverance, and he was right. But here's where the part of the story that nobody really talks about begins. Are you curious? As these soldiers made their way toward England on the ships, they carried a deep psychological burden beyond their physical exhaustion. Most of them hadn't slept properly in days. They hadn't eaten. They had lost their friends, their comrades in battle. They had been forced to leave their weapons, tanks, and all their heavy equipment behind in France. But the heaviest burden they carried was a feeling of shame. Yes, shame. These men were professional soldiers. They had gone to France to defend their country, to stop Hitler's armies. And now, they were coming back with their tails between their legs, having lasted less than 2 weeks. At least, that's how they felt. The words of one veteran years later perfectly sum up this feeling. We didn't feel like we were beaten, nor did we feel like we had won. We were just scared to death. Another soldier said this: "We thought we'd get a bad reception at home. We expected to be humiliated and scolded by the public. After all, we had come home with our tails between our legs." This fear was completely understandable. Throughout history, armies that returned defeated from war had rarely been treated as heroes. These soldiers were thinking about how they would look their families in the eye, what they would say to their neighbors. Some of them were still filled with this worry even when the English coast came into view from the ship. Would the crowd waiting at the harbor boo them? Would people stare at them as they walked down the street? Would they be branded as deserters or cowards? These thoughts added an extra burden on the shoulders of these already traumatized men. When the first ships docked at Dover Harbor, the sun had just risen. On the morning of May 27, 1940, a strange silence hung over the port. The soldiers looked around as they stepped off the ship, and what they saw completely surprised them. Hundreds of people were waiting along the harbor, but these weren't people booing, angry, or shooting furious glances. On the contrary, there were women holding trays, teacups, and sandwiches. These women in green-gray uniforms were members of the Women's Volunteer Service, and they were smiling. "Welcome home, boys," they called out. "Would you like a cup of tea?" One soldier remembered that moment like this. "I realized I was back in England. They had set up tables there, covered with tons of tea and sandwiches. I was starving. I think I ate 6 sandwiches, which was really greedy, but my stomach was so empty." This welcome was something the soldiers had never expected. Here we see once again just how generous and humane the British people are. These men, who would go on to tell stories for years about the horrors of war, the loss of friends, and the hardships of prison camps, would always hold a special place for this warm welcome they received when they came home. Because at that moment, perhaps at the darkest point of their lives, a cup of tea and a smiling face had changed everything. One soldier said, "We crossed England by train, and when we stopped at the stations along the way, people were waving. The WVS ladies were there, and I thought, this is England, worth fighting for." For the soldiers landing at Dover and Ramsgate harbors, the journey wasn't over yet. The next stop waiting for them was the train stations, and it was here that the true character of the British people would reveal itself. The Southern Railway Company faced an incredible logistical operation. They needed to pick up over 338,000 soldiers from the harbors and distribute them across the country. For this purpose, more than 620 special trains were arranged. Each of these trains, called Dynamo Specials, would transport the soldiers to safe areas. If you're enjoying this story, don't forget to like and subscribe. Thank you. But there was a problem. Most of these men hadn't eaten a proper meal in days. This is where the feeding stations came into play. Stations in the Kent region, including Headcorn, Tunbridge, and Paddock Wood, were designated as stops where soldiers could eat. Each train could only stop for 8 minutes because the trains coming behind needed to pass through. 8 minutes. Feeding hundreds of hungry, exhausted, traumatized soldiers in just 8 minutes seemed impossible. But the WVS women made the impossible happen. The WVS Center, set up at Headcorn Station, worked around the clock. It was so busy that a special spit for roasting meat was even set up on site. The women stood by giant tea urns, constantly preparing boiling water, making sandwiches, and cutting cakes. Between May 27th and June 4th, at these feeding points alone, 50 women and 40 soldier volunteers working at 19 stoves without stopping to boil tea distributed thousands of sandwiches, cakes, and pastries. The numbers were mind-boggling. And they did all of this for free. Most of these women even had to buy their own uniforms out of their own pockets. A complete WVS uniform in 1940 cost about 2 weeks' wages for an average worker. But nobody complained. Everyone was working toward a single goal: to bring those boys home and give them a warm welcome. An incident at one station perfectly captured the spirit of it all. When a tired soldier stumbled as he got off the train, an elderly WVS woman took his arm. "Don't worry, son, you're home now." Years later, when that soldier told this story, his eyes would still well up with tears. What a great and humane nation the British people are. It wasn't just women, children also played their part in this welcome. Small hands carried stacks of postcards and pencils. While soldiers waited on the trains, children gave them these postcards so each one could write a quick note to their families back home. Groups of children distributed these postcards. Soldiers quickly scribbled a few words, and the children collected them and dropped them in mailboxes. Many families learned that their sons were alive for the first time through these postcards. "Mother, I'm fine. See you soon. Your son." These simple few words became a ray of hope in those dark days. Local bakeries also joined in this effort. All the bakeries around Ramsgate and Margate had emptied their flour supplies, and hundreds of housewives had been baking bread, cakes, and biscuits non-stop in their homes. In those days, it was nearly impossible to find bread on the market shelves in these towns, because all the flour was being used for the soldiers. And nobody complained. This event was one of the finest examples of the collective solidarity that would later be called the Dunkirk spirit. And that's how the first moments of the Dunkirk soldiers arrived home unfolded. When they expected shame, they found pride. When they expected humiliation, they found love. When they expected coldness, they found a warm cup of tea and a genuine smile. But the story doesn't end here. In the second part, we'll examine the organization behind this welcome, the incredible sacrifices of the WVS women, and the transformation the soldiers experienced after this in much greater detail. You'll see the tearful scenes on station platforms, the women who collapsed from exhaustion during night shifts, and how a cup of tea lifted an entire nation's morale. Don't forget to like and subscribe for this story. Now, let's move on to part 2. Welcome back to part 2. We're continuing our story. In the first part, we saw how the expectations of the soldiers returning from Dunkirk were completely turned upside down. Instead of shame and humiliation, they found a warm welcome. But who was behind this welcome? Did this miracle happen on its own? No. Behind this miracle were silent heroes, women in green-gray uniforms working day and night, handing out tea until they collapsed from exhaustion, buying sandwich supplies with their own money. The Women's Voluntary Service, the WVS. Now we're going to dive into their story. At this point, I have a request for you. If this story is touching you, please consider subscribing and liking the video. This simple action helps the channel reach more people and brings the stories of these forgotten heroes to light. Now let's continue. In May 1938, a new organization was founded in Britain. Its founder was Stella Isaacs, the Marchioness of Reading. She was an aristocrat, but her vision was extremely practical and people-oriented. The goal was simple: to organize women to protect the civilian population in the coming war. The WVS, Women's Voluntary Service for Civil Defense, showed incredible growth in just 2 years. By 1940, the organization had more than 1 million members. And none of these women were paid. They were all volunteers. Lady Reading's philosophy was very clear. If a job needs doing, it gets done. This simple principle became part of the WVS's DNA. There were no ranks, no hierarchy. A duchess could work side by side with a cleaning lady, doing the same job. Even Queen Elizabeth was the patron of the organization, and all members, regardless of their duties, wore the same badge as their queen. But the real test came with Dunkirk, May 26, 1940. When Operation Dynamo began, phones started ringing off the hook at WVS centers. The list of needs was long and urgent: tea, sandwiches, blankets, hot food, clean clothes, and all of it needed to be ready as soon as possible at the harbors and train stations. The women immediately sprang into action. Headcorn, Tonbridge, Paddock Wood, the train stations in these small towns in the Kent region were transformed into WVS bases. But the busiest center was Headcorn. This was the main distribution point for soldiers, and thousands of hungry, exhausted soldiers passed through this station every day. In just the 9 days between May 27th and June 4th, the WVS women kept 19 stoves running continuously to boil tea. 50 women and 40 soldier volunteers worked in shifts 24 hours a day. Thousands of sandwiches, cakes, pastries, and meat dishes were prepared. And the most striking part? A special spit was even set up at Headcorn Station. Yes, you heard that right. In the middle of the train station, meat was being roasted over an open fire. Because these men hadn't eaten a proper meal in days, and a hot meat dish wasn't a luxury for them, but a vital necessity. Now think about the situation for a moment. More than 338,000 soldiers were being brought ashore at England's southern harbors in just 9 days. Most of these men didn't even know where they were going. Trains were constantly coming and going. Each train could only stop at the station for 8 minutes. 8 minutes! In that time, food and drink had to be delivered to all the soldiers in a carriage. Think about it mathematically. There were on average 500 to 600 soldiers on a train. Giving all of them tea and sandwiches in 8 minutes was an almost impossible task. But the WVS women set up a systematic operation. As the train approached, the women lined up on the platform. In their hands were huge trays with dozens of teacups and sandwiches. When the train stopped, women appeared on both sides of the carriages. Soldiers reached their hands out of the windows, and the women handed them tea and food. One veteran's memory perfectly describes this scene. "We stopped at train stations. Women were waiting for us. They had huge trays in their hands with cakes, sandwiches, buns. Giant tea urns were constantly boiling. Even children were there, handing out postcards and pencils so we could write notes to our families. They collected these cards after we scribbled a few words." For the women, this work was a physically exhausting marathon. Some worked for 48 hours without sleep. Their feet swelled, their hands were covered in burns from the boiling water, but nobody complained. Behind the success of the WVS weren't just the station volunteers. The entire community had mobilized. The housewives of Ramsgate, Margate, and the surrounding towns turned their home kitchens into mini bakeries. Despite the flour shortage, since the government had requisitioned all flour for military use, the women used every last gram they had. For days on end, they baked bread, biscuits, and cakes without leaving their ovens. In those days, it was nearly impossible to find bread on the market shelves in these towns, because all the bread was going to the soldiers, and nobody complained. One record states, "Whatever the local WVS, clubs, and associations did in Ramsgate and its sister towns, the same was done in Sheerness, Margate, Dover, Folkestone, and New Haven." There may be nothing glamorous about these things, but they were an inseparable part of Dunkirk, a necessary, vital part. Local bakers also joined this effort. They suspended their normal commercial activities and devoted all their production to the soldiers. Butchers, cheesemakers, grocers, everyone contributed. This was truly a people's war. If this story is inspiring you, please subscribe and like. Thank you. But the soldiers needed more than just physical help. They also needed emotional support, and the WVS women provided that too. Many of the soldiers returning from Dunkirk were suffering from what we would today call post-traumatic stress disorder. At the time, it was called shell shock. One soldier described the situation in an interview years later. "I started having psychological problems. From time to time, I nearly fainted. Suddenly, it was like being dropped off a cliff. You had lost your mind." Another soldier suffered from claustrophobia for years after returning to England. He spent 3 months in a psychiatric hospital, but even after he recovered, when he saw newsreels with war scenes, he would have a panic attack and have to run outside. He couldn't sit next to people. He couldn't breathe in crowded places. These were the men who came before the WVS women. And what did the women do? They didn't just give them tea. They talked to them. They listened. They offered the warmth of a hand. They said, "You're safe now. You're home." One WVS volunteer remembered it like this: "Some of them couldn't walk when they got off the train. We held them by the arms and carried them. Some couldn't speak. They just stared blankly. We gave them tea. We held their hands. There were those who cried, grown men, warriors, sobbing. We cried with them." In those moments, the therapeutic value of a cup of tea was more powerful than any medicine. For the WVS women, the Dunkirk operation was only the beginning, but even those 9 days took a heavy toll on them. Physical exhaustion was at its peak. There were women who worked for 48 hours, even 72 hours without sleep. Some collapsed while standing on their feet. Women whose hands were burned from handling boiling water urns, who injured their backs carrying heavy trays, but none of them abandoned their post. And then there was the financial burden. The WVS uniform wasn't free. In 1940, a complete WVS uniform set, including a jacket, skirt, coat, hat, and scarf, cost £9, 4 shillings, and 7 pence. That was about 2 weeks' wages for an average worker. So these women weren't just working as volunteers, they were also serving their country while spending money out of their own pockets. Lady Reading's organization had eliminated class distinctions. An aristocratic woman could hand out tea side by side with a working-class woman. Given the rigid class structure of British society, this was a revolutionary situation. And this unity was the essence of the Dunkirk spirit. It was a beautiful coming together of a nation, an exemplary unity. Tea, a simple, ordinary, everyday drink. But in June 1940, on the southern shores of England, a cup of tea meant so much more. That tea said, "You're still human." That tea said, "We care about you." That tea said, "This nightmare is over. You're safe now."
For the soldiers, after waiting for days on the beaches of Dunkirk in hunger, thirst, and fear of death, holding a warm cup of tea was like returning to humanity. One veteran described it like this: "When they put that teacup in my hands were shaking. I hadn't drunk anything in days." But the important thing wasn't the tea itself. It was that woman's smile, her saying, "Welcome home." At that moment, I understood there was something worth fighting for. And perhaps the most powerful expression came from a soldier recalling that moment. As the train crossed England, we stopped at stations along the way. People were waving. The WVS ladies were there, and I thought, this is England worth fighting for. When the Dunkirk operation ended, the work didn't stop for the WVS women. On the contrary, it intensified. Just a few weeks later, the German Luftwaffe began bombing Britain. The Blitz had begun, and the WVS women were once again on the front lines. This time, their duties were different: sheltering survivors from bombed homes, distributing food, finding the relatives of the missing, serving tea to the firefighters working in the rubble of collapsed buildings. During the Blitz, the WVS women helped more than 10,000 people every night, and the price was heavy. 241 WVS members lost their lives during the Blitz. Collapsing buildings, exploding bombs, fires. These women were armored warriors, and some of them gave their lives for this cause. But the organization never faltered. By 1943, the WVS had more than 1 million active members. That number made it the largest women's volunteer organization in the world. The WVS model was so successful that other countries established similar organizations. In the United States, the American Women's Voluntary Services was founded. In India, the Indian WVS was formed, reaching more than 10,000 members. From Australia to South Africa, similar structures emerged in all Commonwealth countries. The starting point for all of this was the British women who handed out tea to the soldiers returning from Dunkirk in those dark days of 1940. And perhaps the sweetest detail of our story came from Wales. As soldiers were being distributed across the country by train, some were sent to Wales, and there they encountered an unexpected surprise. In Wales, pubs were normally closed on Sundays by law, but when the Dunkirk soldiers arrived, the Welsh pub owners ignored the law. They opened their doors. And even better, they refused to take money from the soldiers. "These boys fought for us," they said. "We can buy them a beer." This small detail might get lost in the grand historical narratives, but it perfectly sums up the essence of the Dunkirk spirit. Ordinary people with ordinary gestures showed extraordinary solidarity. And that was the story of the WVS women. There were no magnificent uniforms, shiny medals, or grand speeches. There were only green-gray aprons, tea urns, and an endless spirit of sacrifice. These women served as an invisible army at one of the most critical moments in British history, and the work they did was perhaps just as important as any military operation. Because physically rescuing an army was one thing, but rebuilding that army's spirit was another. The WVS women accomplished both. In the third and final part, we'll examine the long-term effects of Dunkirk. We'll see how this event shaped British identity, how the concept of the Dunkirk spirit was born, and why this story still resonates so powerfully today. And I promise you, the finale will deeply move you. Don't forget to like and subscribe for these great heroes. Now, let's move on to the final part. We're in the final part. Welcome back. We're continuing without slowing down. In the first two parts, we went on an incredible journey. We saw the desperation of 338,000 soldiers stranded on the beaches of Dunkirk. We told how they returned to England feeling shame and defeat, but found the exact opposite of what they expected. We discovered how the WVS women worked day and night, and how a cup of tea healed a nation's spirit. Now, in this final part, we're going to dive into the deepest layer of this story. Why was Dunkirk more than just a military evacuation? How was the concept of the Dunkirk spirit born, and why is it still so powerful today? What were the extraordinary stories behind the civilian boats known as the little ships? And most importantly, how did this event forever change British national identity? If you're ready, let's begin. The most iconic element of the Dunkirk legend is, without a doubt, the little ships. On May 27, 1940, the small vessels section of the British Ministry of Shipping called every boat builder along the coast by telephone. The request was clear and urgent: gather all shallow draft vessels. What did this mean? Dunkirk harbor had been bombed and rendered unusable. Large warships couldn't approach the shallow waters of the beaches. Soldiers were wading in water up to their shoulders, some standing in that position for hours. Small, highly maneuverable boats were needed to rescue them, and England answered the call. Hundreds of boats were gathered from the Thames River and the south and east coasts. These were ordinary boats belonging to ordinary people: pleasure craft, private yachts, fishing boats, sailboats, river barges, even London fire brigade boats. Some of them had never been out on the open sea in their lives. A total of approximately 850 civilian boats set out from Ramsgate Harbor toward Dunkirk. Some boat owners allowed their vessels to be requisitioned, but some went further. "If someone is going to use this boat, it's going to be me," they said, and they took the helm themselves. Most of these volunteers were ordinary citizens with limited sailing experience: fishermen, retired sailors, weekend sailors. Under the bombs of the German Luftwaffe, through minefields, under the threat of enemy submarines, they embarked on an 80-kilometer dangerous journey. And most of them came back, but not all.
Of more than 700 officially registered little ships, more than 100 never saw England again. During the evacuation, a total of more than 220 vessels sank or were rendered unusable, but the lives they saved were priceless. In 9 days, 192,226 British soldiers and 139,000 French soldiers, more than 331,000 people in total, were rescued by these little ships, and approximately 220 warships. Don't forget to subscribe for these heroes. Among the little ships, one stood out in particular, the Sundowner. The owner of this 18-meter motor yacht was a 66-year-old retired sailor. His name was Charles Herbert Lightoller, and this name might sound familiar from one of the most tragic events in maritime history. Yes, you guessed it right. Charles Lightoller was the second officer of the Titanic in 1912. On that terrible night, he was the most senior officer to survive the sinking ship. He had organized the evacuation of women and children, then managed to survive himself by struggling in the freezing waters. 28 years later, 66-year-old Lightoller answered the call of history once again. On May 31, 1940, the Admiralty requisitioned the Sundowner for the Dunkirk operation. Lightoller's answer was clear. If someone is going to use this boat, it's going to be me, they said, and they took the helm themselves. On the morning of June 1st at 10 a.m., Lightoller set out from Ramsgate Harbor with his eldest son, Roger, and an 18-year-old Sea Scout named Gerald Ashcroft. 5 other boats accompanied them. On the way, they rescued the crew of a boat called Westerly, whose engines had failed and was on fire. Then they reached Dunkirk. How many soldiers do you think they loaded onto the Sundowner, which normally had a capacity of 21 people? 130 people. Yes, 130. 75 soldiers were crammed inside the cabin, and 55 were placed on the deck. The men were piled on top of each other like sardines. The waterline had risen to a dangerous level.
The return journey took 12 hours. During this time, Luftwaffe planes attacked repeatedly. Lightoller, with the experience he had gained on the Titanic, displayed incredible maneuvering skills. He dodged bombs and machine gun fire. The greatest danger were the waves created by the fast-passing destroyers. The overloaded boat nearly capsized from these waves. When they arrived at Ramsgate, the soldiers excitedly crowded to one side of the boat to get ashore. The boat nearly tipped over. Roger Lightoller shouted, "Everyone lie down on the ground and don't move until I say so." The soldiers obeyed. And so, without a single loss of life, 130 lives were saved. The Lightoller family's tragedy didn't end there. Charles's youngest son, Brian, had been shot down over Germany as an RAF pilot on the first night of the war and lost his life. His eldest son, Roger, was killed in a German commando raid in France in the final months of the war. But Charles Lightoller himself passed away peacefully in 1952 at the age of 78. He had survived the Titanic disaster, won medals for heroism in World War I, and saved hundreds of lives at Dunkirk. The Sundowner still exists today. It's on display at the Ramsgate Maritime Museum. The character Mr. Dawson, played by Mark Rylance in the 2017 film Dunkirk, was inspired by this man, Charles Lightoller. The Sundowner wasn't alone, of course. Another legend was the paddle steamer called Medway Queen. This old ship, which normally carried passengers on the Thames River, made a total of 7 trips during the Dunkirk operation, the most trips of any vessel. It went back and forth to Dunkirk 7 times, and it rescued a total of 7,000 soldiers. That's why it was given the nickname the Heroine of Dunkirk. Or the Massey Shaw, London's famous fireboat. It was actually sent to put out fires, but in the end, it made 3 trips and rescued more than 500 soldiers.
Or the Tamzine, the smallest boat to participate in the evacuation. It was only 4.3 meters long, but even it worked tirelessly to ferry soldiers who had waited in line for hours to larger ships. The RNLI, the Royal National Lifeboat Institution, supported the operation with 19 lifeboats. The Ramsgate and Margate lifeboat crews picked up 800 men from the beaches during the first night. Behind each one was a separate heroic story. Wednesday, June 4, 1940. Operation Dynamo had officially ended. More than 338,000 soldiers had been rescued, and Prime Minister Winston Churchill took the podium to address the House of Commons. This speech would go down in history as one of the most powerful political speeches of the 20th century. Churchill described the military situation in detail, the battles at Boulogne and Calais, the Belgian king's unexpected surrender, the difficulties of the evacuation. But what really made an impact was the final part of the speech. Churchill described Dunkirk as a colossal military disaster, but he also called it a miracle of deliverance. And then he spoke those famous words, "Even though large tracts of Europe and many old and famous states have fallen or may fall into the grip of the Gestapo and all the odious apparatus of Nazi rule, we shall not flag or fail. We shall go on to the end. We shall fight in France. We shall fight on the seas and oceans. We shall fight with growing confidence and growing strength in the air. We shall defend our island, whatever the cost may be. We shall fight on the beaches. We shall fight on the landing grounds. We shall fight in the fields and in the streets. We shall fight in the hills. We shall never surrender." These words set the British people's spirit on fire. But here's the interesting thing. Churchill didn't give this speech on the radio. He only delivered it in Parliament. BBC announcers read excerpts from the speech on the evening news. Churchill didn't record this speech in his own voice until 1949. Yet years later, people remembered listening to Churchill's radio speech. This was a perfect example of how collective memory works. The speech was so powerful that people began to believe they had actually heard it. And Churchill also had a backstage comment. Right after finishing the speech, he muttered to a colleague beside him, "And we'll fight them with broken beer bottles, because that's bloody well all we've got." This bitterly summarized the reality of the situation. The British Army had been forced to leave all its heavy weapons, tanks, and vehicles behind at Dunkirk. 2,472 guns, 65,000 vehicles, 20,000 motorcycles, and 445 tanks had been lost. The island was facing the threat of invasion, and its defense capacity had been severely weakened. But morale was different. At this point, if this content has been valuable to you, please consider subscribing to the channel. If you turn on the notification bell, you'll be notified of new videos. Preparing in-depth history content like this requires serious research, and your support ensures that this work can continue. Now let's return to our story. Where were we? When exactly was the concept of the Dunkirk spirit born? The first recorded use was in Parliament just 1 year after the event, in 1941. Politician Sir John Wardlaw Milne, speaking about the requirement for factory workers to work 7 days, said, "We cannot expect workers to continue working indefinitely with the Dunkirk spirit." But the concept took on much deeper meanings over time. The Cambridge Dictionary defines the Dunkirk spirit as the willingness of a group of people who are in a bad situation to all help each other. The Macmillan Dictionary says, an attitude of being very strong in a difficult or impossible situation and refusing to accept defeat. The Longman Dictionary goes even further. The determination to succeed in a difficult or impossible situation, believed to be a typical British characteristic. Notice there are common themes in all these definitions: difficulty, solidarity, determination, and refusing to accept defeat. Dunkirk was actually a military defeat. Even Churchill admitted this. He had said, "Wars are not won by evacuations." But this defeat was transformed into a narrative of victory. How? Because the focus was shifted. Not military failure, but human triumph was emphasized. Not defeat, but deliverance. Not losses, but those who were saved. Not the army, but the people. And this narrative of a people's war became one of the cornerstones of British national identity. One of the most revolutionary aspects of Dunkirk was that it temporarily eliminated class differences. Britain in 1940 was still an extremely rigid class society. There were sharp lines between the aristocracy, the middle class, and the working class. People were identified by their accents, their clothes, their education, and treated accordingly. But on the beaches of Dunkirk, everyone was equal. A general and a private waited in the same queue. A lord's son and a miner's son boarded the same boat. And in England, a duchess and a cleaning lady handed out tea side by side. This showed equality. Lady Reading, the founder of the WVS, had consciously built this philosophy into the organization's DNA. There were no ranks. If a job needs doing, it gets done, whoever you are. The little ship's fleet reflected the same spirit. Wealthy yacht owners, fishermen, river workers, retired sailors, they all rode in the same dangerous waters for the same purpose. Christopher Nolan, the director of the 2017 Dunkirk film, made a conscious choice to emphasize this cross-class solidarity. He used characters with different British accents in the film, symbolizing people coming together from all across the United Kingdom. Historian Penny Summerfield from the University of Manchester, in her article examining Dunkirk's exceptional place in popular memory, argues that at the heart of the concept is cross-class reconciliation and people power. The Dunkirk narrative became a national myth over time. The Dunkirk films made in 1958 and 2017 reinforced this mythology. Both films highlighted collective effort rather than individual heroism. Christopher Nolan rarely even used the characters' names. The message was clear. This was a nation's story. Of course, there are criticisms too. The French contribution is largely overlooked, as 139,000 French soldiers were also evacuated. The role of colonial soldiers is forgotten. But myths have a life of their own. If you're enjoying this story, don't forget to subscribe. Thank you. In 1953, 5 former combatants came together in Leeds. The Dunkirk Veterans Association was born this way. The association grew rapidly. At its peak, it reached more than 165,000 members worldwide. Every year, veterans made a pilgrimage to Dunkirk. In the mid-1970s, more than 20,000 veterans participated in this visit. In 2000, the association closed. At the final meeting, the youngest of the 52 members was 74 years old. But the legacy lives on. The Association of Dunkirk Little Ships is still active. Every 5 years, the fleet returns to Dunkirk. The Sundowner awaits visitors at the Ramsgate Museum. Beyond the heroic narratives, there was also a dark reality. Many veterans suffered from what we would today call post-traumatic stress disorder. Vic Tyers suffered from severe claustrophobia and spent 3 months in a psychiatric hospital. Reg Dance said in 1999, "I started having psychological problems. Suddenly, it was like being dropped off a cliff." There were also suicides on the beaches of Dunkirk. The scene of the soldier walking into the waves in Christopher Nolan's film was based on real events. These traumas were mostly carried in silence. The concept of masculinity at the time stigmatized showing emotional weakness. The Dunkirk spirit still lives in British social discourse today. In 2020, during the COVID-19 pandemic, Queen Elizabeth recalled her first radio speech in 1940. NHS volunteers were seen as the heirs of the WVS. The Dunkirk image was also used in Brexit debates. The 2017 film was released in the midst of these discussions. Dunkirk is no longer just a historical event. It has become a symbol, a national myth. Now we've come to the end of this three-part journey. So, what was Dunkirk really? From a military perspective, it was a disaster. Nearly the entire British expeditionary force returned to England, having lost its heavy weapons, tanks, and vehicles. France fell within a few weeks. Britain was left alone, facing the threat of invasion. But from another perspective, it was a miracle. Initially, it was thought that only 20,000 to 30,000 soldiers could be rescued. In the end, more than 338,000 soldiers came home. These men formed the core of the British Army for the rest of the war. In the Normandy landings, in the fall of Berlin, these Dunkirk veterans were there. And perhaps most importantly, Dunkirk transformed a nation's spirit. Think about it. These soldiers returned feeling ashamed, feeling defeated. They expected to be humiliated. But what they found was endless compassion and acceptance. The WVS women handing out tea at train stations, the housewives baking bread in their homes, the civilians risking their boats, the children handing out postcards, the Welsh pub owners breaking the Sunday law to offer them a beer. All of this sent a message: you are our sons, you fought for us, and we are with you. That message rebuilt the spirit of a defeated army. One soldier said years later, "As the train crossed England, we stopped at stations along the way. People were waving, the WVS ladies were there, and I thought, this is England worth fighting for." That was the real miracle of Dunkirk. Physically rescuing 338,000 soldiers was an achievement, but saving the spirit of those soldiers, of that nation, that was a far greater victory. And today, 85 years later, we still talk about the Dunkirk spirit. We still tell the stories of those days. We still believe in the power of a cup of tea, a piece of bread, an outstretched hand. Because Dunkirk taught us this: even in the darkest moments, the light of humanity never goes out. We've come to the end of this three-part series. If this journey has been valuable to you, please like the video and subscribe to the channel. Share your thoughts in the comments. What do you feel about Dunkirk? What does this story say to you? I'll be back with a new history story in the next video. Until then, may the Dunkirk spirit be with you. Take good care of yourselves, and goodbye.